Throughout NHL history, few prospects have ever generated as much hype as Eric Lindros. On the heels of a sublime junior career, the transcendent youngster was the undisputed #1 pick in the 1991 NHL Draft and was ostensibly headed to Quebec City, where the floundering Nordiques were salivating at the prospect of landing a transformative talent. But they never did. Instead, in a wildly controversial decision, the resolute youngster decided to hold out after going first overall, a decision that ultimately precipitated one of the biggest trades hockey has ever seen, an epic swap that changed the course of NHL history and paved the way for one of hockey's most unforgettable dynasties to take off. As the 1990s dawned, the hockey world found itself enamored with a teenager hailed as the second coming of Wayne Gretzky. A hulking power forward whose size and physicality belied his exceptional playmaking and scoring touch, Eric Lindros had been earmarked for hockey greatness since his Atom days. And as he toyed with the competition in the North American Junior Hockey League, it only became clearer that he was destined to dominate in the NHL. As then Philadelphia Flyers GM Bobby Clarke told Sports Illustrated in 1989, "He's the best 16-year-old player I've ever seen. He could play in the NHL right now." If it seems odd that hockey's most prodigious amateur was developing his skills in the second-rate North American Junior Hockey League rather than playing Major Junior, that's because it was. But Lindros ended up in the NAHL of his own volition after he and his parents decided that he wouldn't report to the Sault Ste. Marie Greyhounds, the Ontario Hockey League franchise that had selected him first overall in the 1989 Ontario Priority Selection. It was a controversial decision at the time, but it also evinced Lindros' steely determination to do what he felt was best for him, a principle he'd stick to throughout his career. Besides, Lindros eventually made it to the OHL anyway, as the Greyhounds traded his rights to the Oshawa Generals midway through the 1989-1990 campaign. There, Lindros continued to shine, dazzling with his enviable combination of size, skill, and toughness, and ultimately putting together one of the most impressive major junior careers ever. Across parts of 3 seasons in Oshawa, Lindros averaged more than 2 points per game, racking up numerous personal accolades and transforming the Generals into a powerhouse. In his first partial season with Oshawa, Lindros helped the Generals to their first Memorial Cup in nearly 5 decades, notching a team-high 36 points in 17 postseason games. The following year, in his only full season in the OHL, Lindros recorded a ridiculous 149 points in 57 games and was named Most Outstanding Player throughout all of Major Junior. Meanwhile, he was also inflating his stock with his performance on the international stage. Lindros helped Canada to consecutive gold medals at the World Juniors in 1990 and 1991, earning All-Star honors in his second go-around after leading his country and finishing second overall in the tournament with 17 points. The hype was real. Lindros looked like a bona fide superstar. They had even started calling him the next one. And as the 1991 NHL entry draft loomed, it was a foregone conclusion that his name would be the first one called. Lindros, it seemed, was going to become the cornerstone of the Quebec Nordiques, the hapless organization that held the first overall selection. And they needed him. After enjoying some modest success in the early 80s following their migration from the World Hockey Association, the Nordiques had fallen off a cliff by decade's end, finishing with a measly 12 wins in 1989-1990 before mustering just 16 victories the following season. And although their years of floundering had landed them several building blocks through the draft, namely Joe Sakic, Matt Sundin, and Owen Nolan, Lindros was poised to be their piece de resistance, their springboard back to contention, and possibly the first Stanley Cup in franchise history. Except that he wasn't. Ahead of the draft, Lindros indicated that he wasn't interested in playing for Quebec, a position that Nordiques management was very much aware of. Fans and media speculated endlessly as to why Lindros was disinclined to become the face of the Nordiques, with the most popular theories being the team's lack of success, the dearth of lucrative endorsement opportunities in a small market like Quebec City, and the fact that Quebec is a French-speaking province with a heavy tax rate. Eventually, it came out that Lindros' objections stemmed from issues he had with the team's management, specifically owner Marcel Aubout, something Lindros himself confirmed years later. In any event though, the bottom line was that Lindros wasn't going to Quebec. Yet, when draft day arrived, the Nordiques just couldn't pass him up, foregoing the countless trade offers they received for their highly coveted first overall pick, and instead using it on the most highly touted junior player since Mario Lemieux.
The Quebec Nordiques are very proud to select as first pick overall in the 1991 NHL Annual Draft from the Oshawa Generals of the OHL, Eric Lindros.
Right off the bat, it became clear that the Nordiques would be hard-pressed to convince Lindros to suit up.
You'll notice that Marcel Aubu, the president of the Quebec Nordiques, presented Eric Lindros with a sweater. Eric Lindros just simply took that sweater, draped it across his arm. He will not put the sweater on. He made that perfectly clear to the Quebec Nordiques.
Just like he had with Sault Ste. Marie years earlier, Lindros refused to report, kicking off a prolonged holdout that saw him rejoin the Generals for another season in junior and becoming persona non grata in Quebec in the process.
Lindros snubs Quebec, blared the sports section of Le Soleil. And on the front of Le Journal de Québec, "I'm going back to Oshawa," says Lindros. The story had Quebecers fuming.
I said if he doesn't want to act like a man because he's afraid of playing with real men, so then he should play with little boys and stay on with little boys.
The Nordiques tried to negotiate with Lindros while he kept his skills sharp in Oshawa and with the Canadian national teams at both the '92 World Juniors and Winter Olympics, but the young phenom wouldn't budge, preferring to wait out the year and re-enter the draft in the summer of '92. Finally, after a 12-month standoff dubbed L'Affaire Lindros, and with the draft fast approaching and Quebec suddenly facing the prospect of losing Lindros for nothing, the Nordiques resigned themselves to the fact that they'd have to trade their supposed savior. Not surprisingly, with Lindros suddenly available, rival teams inundated the Nordiques with calls. Less than a week out from their de facto deadline to make a deal, Quebec had no fewer than 5 serious offers for Lindros. Trade talks continued right up until draft day, when the Nordiques finally agreed to send Lindros to the Philadelphia Flyers. The saga, it seemed, was over. Except it wasn't. In a shocking twist, hours after reaching a deal with the Flyers, Aubu agreed to trade Lindros to a different team, the New York Rangers. Naturally, chaos ensued, as both teams believed they had acquired a new franchise cornerstone. To settle the matter, an independent arbitrator was brought in to suss out which team had rightfully acquired Lindros, and 10 days later, he ruled that the Flyers trade was the valid one. And it was a doozy. In exchange for Lindros, the Flyers traded the rights to their recently drafted Swedish phenom named Peter Forsberg, former Vezina Trophy winner Ron Hextall, up-and-coming forward Mike Ricci, 3 other players, their first-round picks in 1993 and 1994, plus $15 million in cash. Few trades have ever had such an outsized impact on the course of NHL history. For starters, despite giving up the biggest name in the trade, the haul that Quebec landed for Lindros was a transformative one for the woebegone franchise, which now boasted a much improved roster and an impossibly deep asset base. And although their glow-up didn't culminate until after Aubu sold the Nordiques, who then up and left for Denver and rebranded into the Avalanche, Colorado's staggering success from the mid-90s through the early 2000s can very much be traced back to the Lindros deal. Forsberg, after all, was an integral part of the Avalanche dynasty and was later inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame. The same goes for Patrick Roy. How did the Avalanche land him? By trading fellow goaltender Jocelyn Thibault, whom they had selected with the Flyers' first-round pick in the '93 draft. Ricci, meanwhile, was a valuable contributor on Colorado's Stanley Cup winning squad in 1996. And after Colorado traded him for San Jose's first-round pick in '98, the Avalanche used that selection to take Alex Tanguay, who shined as a sophomore on Colorado's Cup-winning team in 2001. And there are countless other ways that the Lindros trade, which the Nordiques resisted and begrudged and nearly reneged on, contributed to and shaped that epic run by the Avalanche, whose success in the years following the trade dwarfed that of the Flyers. While Lindros was a star from the moment he took the ice in Philadelphia at the age of 19, and ultimately played in 6 All-Star games while averaging a whopping 1.34 points per game in a Flyers uniform, an endless string of injuries and concussions plagued him over his 8-year run in Philly, throughout which his club made the playoffs 6 times but never once hoisted the Stanley Cup. And eventually, Lindros' tenure with the Flyers ended much like it began, with a holdout. Following the breakdown of his relationship with Flyers GM Bobby Clarke, Lindros sat out the entire 2000-2001 season before ultimately getting traded to, wait for it, the Rangers. Still, while the Flyers' initial trade for Lindros didn't yield any banners, it was nevertheless a major inflection point for the franchise. Lindros almost single-handedly reignited Philly's passion for hockey following an unprecedented down period, played an outsized role in getting the Flyers a new arena in the mid-90s, and was the centerpiece of one of the most exciting and memorable eras in franchise history. But the ramifications of the Lindros trade go beyond the fates of the two franchises involved. In the wake of Obu's messy double dip, the NHL tightened up what had to that point been a decidedly casual trading process, instituting a formal written procedure to ensure no more shenanigans from unscrupulous executives. Of greater consequence, however, is the impact that the Lindros trade had on player salaries throughout the NHL. The trade, after all, had given Lindros all the leverage in the world in his initial contract negotiations with the Flyers, who had just given up a king's ransom for him, and he used that to effectively shake up the NHL economy. Before making his NHL debut, Lindros was the highest paid player in the league, boasting a larger salary than Gretzky, and the rest of the league noticed. According to author Todd Deneau, at the outset of the 1989-1990 season, only two NHL players, Gretzky and Lemieux, had seven-figure salaries. But by the end of Lindros' rookie season, there were 44 players earning a salary of $1 million or more. Before Lindros' career was over, the league scuttled an entire season in an effort to rein in player salaries. Ultimately, more than 3 decades later, it's no stretch to say that the Lindros trade was a pivotal moment in NHL history, and that the conviction of one gifted youngster effectively reshaped the landscape of the league. Thanks for watching. If you like this video and want to see more content like this, hit that subscribe button.